Since its release over 25 years ago, no Final Fantasy spin-off title has had the same lasting effect on the franchise and fanbase as the original Final Fantasy Tactics. Set in the fictional world of Ivalice during a conflict known as the War of the Lions, Tactics served as a huge departure from all of the previous games. This meant that although numerous hallmarks were still there, such as the job system and the majority of established naming conventions, others were not. For example, instead of there being a set and established party, more emphasis was placed on recruitment and development of randomly generated characters. And elements such as the famed ATB system were ditched in favour of a new CTB system, so that its position as a strategy role-playing game could be codified. Everything was then held together by a fantastic narrative, which included a lot of political intrigue, numerous subplots, and an incredible focus on backstory and character motivations. The man behind many of these machinations was Yasumi Matsuno. A few years prior, when working at Quest, Matsuno released Tactics Ogre Let Us Cling Together on the Super Famicom. Also an isometric strategy role-playing game, Tactics Ogre told a deep and dark tale of medieval political intrigue and the realities of war, similar to the way that Tactics did so. And such was its success that despite coming from a much smaller publisher, its sales were on par with juggernauts such as Donkey Kong Country 2, Front Mission, and Final Fantasy V. This success caused numerous individuals within the industry to sit up and take notice, and one of them was Hironobu Sakaguchi. After Matsuno joined Square, Production Development Division 4 was established, and they were given the task of creating a tactical Final Fantasy game based on preliminary design documents that Sakaguchi had created. Hiroyuki Ito, who had just served as co-director on Final Fantasy VI, would also be assigned to assist. Collectively, they had fun working together, sharing ideas around battle systems, world building, and narrative design. And when Final Fantasy Tactics launched, it was both surprising and unsurprising. Final Fantasy had been taken in a bold new direction, but thanks to how everything had been executed, it felt natural. As a spin-off title, Tactics was never expected to reach the same heights as the mainline entries, but sentiment amongst critics and fans was very positive, and nearly 2.5 million copies were sold worldwide, earning an estimated $150 million. These figures made Tactics the best-selling standalone entry in the franchise, a title it still holds today. Now, due to its critical and commercial success, Final Fantasy Tactics was positioned as a prime candidate for franchising, and Sakaguchi was willing to break one of his own rules to make sure this happened. Up until that point, Sakaguchi had adopted a strict policy when it came to the expansion of the Final Fantasy franchise. Every entry would be standalone. There would be no sequels and no spin-offs based on existing lore, at least in video game format. Any expansions would therefore have to take place through the production of supporting materials. And there were plenty of prominent examples, such as Final Fantasy II Nightmare's Labyrinth, a novel that rewrote the story of the original game, and Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals, an OVA that served as a sequel to Final Fantasy V. Provisional planning on Final Fantasy Tactics II began towards the end of the millennium. But because both Matsuno and Ito were busy working on Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy IX, Sakaguchi vowed to oversee the project himself and sought a credible outsourcing partner who could deliver on the vision. Unfortunately, no suitable partner could be found, and due to the pressure Square were facing at the time and how many projects were running concurrently, Final Fantasy Tactics II ended up being cancelled. This meant an expansion of Ivalice wouldn't happen until a few years later via Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. Appearing on Nintendo's Game Boy Advance as part of a new publishing deal that Square had negotiated with Nintendo, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance was overseen by Matsuno and many former members of Quest, the developer of Tactics Ogre, who had recently been acquired by Square. But even though Matsuno was involved, the game was directed by Yuichi Murasawa, who had directed Tactics Ogre, The Night of Lodis. It meant the pair had differing creative views, but they were still able to find suitable compromises. And when Final Fantasy Tactics Advance launched, it became a must-have title for the system. This, along with the successful release of Final Fantasy XII, renewed interest in the Ivalice sub-series, and Square Enix attempted to capitalize with the creation of the Ivalice Alliance. and front and center in this collection was a brand new version of Final Fantasy Tactics, which had been developed for the PlayStation Portable. This enhanced version, which was called Final Fantasy Tactics: The War of the Lions, featured updated visuals, a new localization of the game's original script, an expanded list of jobs, new content that linked it to the compilation, and fully animated cutscenes. Due to how much was added, The War of the Lions ended up proving to be very successful for Square Enix. And while the sales figures were much lower than the original release, with less than 1 million copies sold, the install base of the console was also much lower. And the game outperformed from a critical perspective, with it holding an 88 on Metacritic. In spite of this, critics did still raise issues regarding the game's technical performance, as the smoother 60 frames per second gameplay was not retained. These issues were then fixed ahead of ports for the game on iOS and Android devices. From that point forward though, perhaps because of the underwhelming performance of the Evil Elite Alliance as a whole, Tactics has taken a back seat, only used to fuel small doses of nostalgia through the likes of Ramza appearing as a guest character in Dissidia NT and the return to Evil Elite's Alliance Raid series in Final Fantasy XIV. In a 2009 interview with Dengeki, Matsuno then hinted that he'd been thinking about the prospect of reviving the series in some way, but fans still didn't have any concrete proof around what was being done with the series, and it meant the mobile versions were the only way for fans to experience Tactics on modern devices. And that would be the end of this story in an official sense. But in the latter half of 2021, something happened that stoked the imaginations of Tactics fans all around the world, and gave them hope that a re-release of Tactics for modern consoles and PCs was in the works. Early in September of 2021, a developer named Igor July was digging into Nvidia's GeForce Now client and stumbled across something very intriguing: a large list of games supposedly slated to be coming to PC featured in the client's database. Contained in this list were many curious items, such as 2018's God of War, the as of then unannounced Resident Evil 4 remake, a new Mortal Kombat, and high-definition versions of Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3. What's more, this leak also contained a number of Square Enix titles, many of which were unannounced, and while some were not too surprising, others were. The Final Fantasy VII Remake, for example, was expected to make an appearance on PC eventually, so it was not really surprising to see it included in the leaked list. But what was unexpected was the inclusion of games thought to be nothing more than rumours, wild speculation, or just games fans hoped would be made. This grouping contained the likes of Kingdom Hearts 4, a Final Fantasy IX remake, an untitled card game, an unnamed new strategy title, and remasters of Chrono Cross, Tactics Ogre, and of course, Final Fantasy Tactics. Nvidia claimed that this list was for internal use only, and that the majority of unannounced games featured were speculative. But since then, the GeForce leak has proven to be more Nostradamical in nature than first thought, as many of the games have subsequently been announced or released. In the case of Square Enix, Kingdom Hearts 4 was announced to be in development during April of 2022, and the Final Fantasy VII Remake did find its way onto PC. The unnamed card game ended up being Yoko Taro's Voice of Cards, and the new strategy game was more than likely Diofield Chronicle. Remasters of Chrono Cross and Tactics Ogre were not on the radar for many, but both ended up being released during 2022, and the latter in particular released to wide acclaim. As of right now, it means almost every game on that list has either been announced or released. The only exceptions to this are the Final Fantasy IX Remake and the Final Fantasy Tactics Remaster. And it then begs the question, if these games are in development, when are Square Enix planning to make that public? Placing specific focus on the Final Fantasy Tactics Remaster, Square Enix has spent considerable effort on creating a new suite of ports for older Final Fantasy games, and games from the PlayStation and PlayStation 2 eras have been made available on almost every system going right now. The only exception is Final Fantasy Tactics. Square Enix has also been releasing a ton of tactical role-playing games in recent years, and with Tactics Ogre Reborn doing as well as it did, as for example, it outsold God of War Ragnarok during its launch week in Japan by a sizable margin, it stands to reason that a Final Fantasy Tactics remaster that received the same treatment would fare much, much better. It's easy to point at the readily available iOS and Android versions of the game, and suggest that this is Square Enix's answer as to where they want people to play the game. But that also isn't all that consistent, especially given their penchant for porting the mobile versions of a variety of other games, most notably Final Fantasy IX and Chrono Trigger, and using them as the definitive versions for console and PC expansion. So, why no tactics? At this point, it's hard to say, but where there's smoke, there's quite often fire. And since the NVIDIA leak, there have been numerous comments from Square Enix employees and industry insiders hinting that the Final Fantasy Tactics Remaster is indeed in development. For example, in February of 2023, Ichiro Hazama, producer of Theatre of the Final Bar Line, mentioned that the reason why so few Tactics characters were featured in the game was due to the Tactics team being incredibly busy at the moment, because they were heavily involved in another project. Adding to this, journalist Jason Schreier also chimed in on the topic, telling one hopeful fan that news of the game is still on the way. What would turn out to be the biggest tease, though, came from none other than Yasumi Matsuno himself. When responding to an individual who expressed their excitement at the prospect of a remaster, Matsuno replied and said, "If we were to remaster it, what do you think about whether it's better to weaken the Thunder God Cid, who was accused of destroying the balance?" While it could all just be fun and games, it does seem like a rather specific question to answer in a public forum given the rumours around the title, especially if the Tactics team definitely wasn't currently developing a Final Fantasy Tactics remaster. It's also important to consider how tightly Square Enix plans their marketing schedules and announcements, especially when it comes to Final Fantasy titles. When the Tactics remaster was listed in the NVIDIA link, Square Enix was in full Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker mode, which was then followed by Crisis Core Reunion, Final Fantasy XVI, Ever Crisis, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. In this specific case though, the marketing of Square Enix's various strategy games may also have played a role, as in recent years they did release Triangle Strategy, DioField Chronicle, and Tactics Ogre Reborn, and releasing a Tactics remaster so soon could have led to general fatigue. So where does this then leave the Tactics remaster? Well, at this moment, we'll have to wait and see. But if one is coming, the recent success of Tactics Ogre Reborn has given a clear indication as to how much demand there is and how much success the game would bring. But what do you all think? Do you believe the Tactics remaster is still on the way? Or is it nothing but vaporware? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Adam Aguilara, Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Justin Dent, and Sukun TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.